It's the fourth Sunday of Easter, and we're in I don't know what number of weeks of lockdown, and our lives are changing. And if we look at the two readings before the Gospel this morning from Acts chapter 2, the disciples were learning new ways of living. They were learning how to share, how to care for each other, and how to spread the Gospel. This was a completely new way of how to be and how to live. Pretty much the same as what we have had to deal with ourselves. We've all had to learn different ways and new ways of living. Probably our routines have changed. My routine home here has changed in some ways for the better, in other ways maybe not so good. And it will be the same for all of us. Twiglet, on the other hand, is loving this new routine that we have. She takes me out. It's the first thing we do every morning. She wants to do a long walk, 2.5 miles before breakfast. And then we have to go another walk in the afternoon. And she's got very used to this set pattern, new routine. It's not so easy for us sometimes because we don't have those same no responsibilities and other pressures and pulls and tugs on our hearts, our minds and our time. Sometimes when it comes to creating a new routine, we struggle with what is it we're going to stop doing to allow time to do what we think we need to do. It seems that nowadays we seem to all have more time than we've ever had. Time that we've really not really wanted to be left with. And we struggle with how to fill that time. Yet before the lockdown, some of us were so busy we wondered what on earth we would do if we were given all this free time. It's a change, and we don't do change very well. And when you read all the stuff in the news that talks about life has changed and has probably changed for good. Things will never go back to what we always thought of as being normal. But is normal the right thing? Is normal the right way to be? These are all big questions that some of us will have to face at some point when things start to go back to, we call it normal, but I don't think it will be. When things start to go back, what are we going to do and how are we going to be? We're given a model in the book of Acts of how the apostles changed, how their lives changed, how they lived, how they chose to exist and work and live, praying and worshipping together. That model stands just as importantly today as it did back then. Then we've had also a reading from Peter, from 1 Peter, where Peter writes about how suffering is so important, but it's not important. It's so individual. All of us feel that we suffer differently, and yet our suffering is as nothing compared to the suffering endured by Christ, is what Peter is talking about. And Peter talks about suffering when we've done nothing wrong, suffering when we have found ourselves in a place we don't want to be, through no fault of our own. We could all relate to that at the moment because some of us are really struggling. How do we cope with not being able to visit to see family? How do we cope with all the restrictions on our movements? Some of us might see this as suffering. Others might also see this as a blessing, as a godsend. God looking after us, God providing for us. But in that suffering of keeping ourselves separate, in that suffering of social isolation, we are showing our care and support for others, and how we too will suffer with them, just like Christ suffers with us. And then we've also had the Gospel reading. the Gospel reading where Jesus talks about our need for a shepherd. And he talks about how, as the Good Shepherd, he comes not to confine us in a sheep pen, but to lead us, to teach us, and to guide us. And he promises that those who follow Jesus will have a life, and life in abundance. And that life in abundance in all circumstances, especially in these days when our circumstances have changed so much. Jesus promises us a full and real life, full of all the blessings and all the joy that comes from knowing how we are forgiven. And that forgiveness relates back again to Peter's letter, where he talks about suffering and forgiving. And then also in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 2, where the suffering of the new disciples and the new way of living, the change to lifestyle, was also encompassed with the forgiving and the forgiveness of debt. We must never forget that we need to forgive just as much as we need to be forgiven. And how do we respond to all this? We need to think about and pray for those who are suffering and those who are struggling. I have spent many long phone calls this last week or so, speaking with several people who are struggling with the isolation. They are struggling with the concept of not being able to do what they want to do. Some people struggling just with the day-to-day, can't get their medication. Everyone is suffering in a different way, and we need to pray for each other, but we need to pray especially for those who are suffering, and they don't need to be those who are known to us. We need to pray for everyone who is struggling through this situation. Families who are bereaved, unable to say goodbye in the way they would like to. Families who are struggling because they cannot visit relatives who are in care homes. And those who are in care homes who are struggling with not being able to be visited by their families. Our prayers and our thoughts should be for those who are less fortunate than us in our own society, especially because they are so close to us. We must pray for them to be blessed by God, that God will be near to them, just as I pray that God will be near to us and each and every one of us. Amen.